Hello, my name is Akim Harriman and I'm here with Professor Amy Verdun from the University of Victoria to talk about the executive and legislative institutions of the European Union. The first thing that many students notice when studying EU institutions is that there are so many. There are four main political institutions: the European Council, the European Commission, the Council of the EU, and the European Parliament. What is the basic logic of this institutional setup?
The basic institutional logic is to keep a balance between, on the one hand, member states, and on the other hand, the EU as a collective. And these four institutions represent these two different components, and then within those two, also a different way of being represented. So the two intergovernmental institutions, the ones that sort of represent the member states, are the European Council and the Council of the EU that you've mentioned. And they are doing different tasks. On the supranational side, there is the European Commission that represents member states, but then at the EU level. But then at the European Parliament level, that's an institution that is a supranational institution where member states' citizens have elected them into power.
The main institutions with executive functions are the European Council and the European Commission. What is the composition of these bodies and what do they do?
So the European Council has the member states and governments, the heads of states and government. So they are the highest individuals from the member states. And it sets the political agenda for the EU. The European Commission has also very high people, so people who've been put forward by member states. But once they sit in that body, they no longer try to advance the interest of a member state, but rather the EU as a whole.
This brings us to institutions with legislative functions, the Council of the EU and the European Parliament. How do they work together when passing EU legislation?
So the system that's used to pass legislation is called the ordinary legislative procedure. And that procedure should be normally used. If a different procedure is used, it would be stipulated in the treaties. Now, in this ordinary legislative procedure, both these two institutions, the Council of the EU, which we often call the Council, and the European Parliament, both have legislative functions. So each of these two institutions need to pass, that means approve, this draft legislation. If they don't like something, they can send it back to the European Commission, who drafts the legislation, and ask for an amendment. And both of these two institutions need to approve before a law has been passed.
How would you compare the EU's political system to Canada's?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think a person watching this podcast will probably be most interested in the EU side of things and may or may not have a full understanding of Canada. But what is different, I think, within the EU setting versus the Canadian setting is that if you are a Canadian person interested in politics, you probably have some interest at the federal level, and some people are not interested in federal politics, and they're interested in the provincial level politics. And so there's a fair bit of understanding of both those procedures. In the EU, what we see is that there's not as many individuals really engaged with EU level policy making. So that level, at EU level, just doesn't seem the same public sphere as we see in, let's say, the Canadian context. So many of the EU citizens will be mostly focusing on the national level, which we would call in Canada the provincial level. And there's less of that deep public sphere at the EU level.
You have emphasized that one of the reasons for the EU's complicated institutional setup is to build consensus between the member states and between national and European concerns. What are some of the downsides of this system?
Yeah, so the consensus building is really important. So when the Council decides on a draft legislation, they like it to be something that is supported by a large group of member states. They try to avoid the situation where a slight majority would accept this and a large minority would be disappointed. And that's what we call consensus building, so seeking as much support as possible. Now, the upside is that once a positive result has been made, that people are happy about it. The downside is that it might take a very long time for legislative to be passed, because maybe it's not yet ready, or that we don't exactly know the differences between the different sides. And again, I mentioned the public sphere. If there isn't that clear political debate, then it makes it also more difficult for journalists and the general public and think tanks to get involved. And so one of the downsides of this consensus-seeking method is kind of making it less interesting for the general public and political actors.